Welcome to the Read Aloud for May 18th. Here we go. All right, we're getting close to being done. Here we go. The triumph. Mr. Jenkins had not gone more than a few paces towards the Grand High Witch's table when a piercing scream rose high above all the other noises in the room, and at the same moment I saw the Grand High Witch go shooting up in the air. Now she was standing on her chair, still screaming. Now she was on the tabletop, waving her arms. What on earth is happening, Grandmama? Wait, my grandmother said, keep quiet and watch. Suddenly, all the other witches, more than 80 of them, began to scream and jump out of their seats as those spikes were being stuck in their bottoms. Some were standing on chairs, some were up on tables, and all of them were wiggling about and waving their arms in the most extraordinary manner. Then all at once they became quiet. Then they stiffened. Every single witch stood there as stiff and silent as a corpse. The whole room became deathly still. They're shrinking, Grandmama, I said. They're shrinking just like I did. I know they are, my grandmother said. It's the mouse maker, I cried. Look, some of them are growing fur on their faces. Why is it working so quickly, Grandmama? I'll tell you why, my grandmother said. Because all of them have had massive overdoses, just like you. It's thrown the alarm clock right out of whack. Everyone in the dining room was standing up now to get a better view. People were moving closer. They were beginning to crowd around two long tables. My grandmother lifted Bruno and me up so we wouldn't miss any of the fun. In her excitement, she jumped up on her chair so that she could see over the heads of the crowd. And in another few seconds, all the witches had completely disappeared, and the tops of the two long tables were swarming with small brown mice. All over the dining room, women were screaming and strong men were turning white in the face and shouting, "It's crazy! This can't happen! Let's get the heck out of here!" Waiters were attacking the mice with chairs and wine bottles and anything else that came to hand. I saw a chef in a tall white hat rushing out from the kitchen brandishing a frying pan, and another one just behind him wielding a carving knife above his head, and everyone was yelling, "Mice, mice, mice! Just get rid of the mice!" Only the children in the room were really enjoying it. They all seemed to know instinctively that something good was going on right there in front of them, and they were clapping and cheering and laughing like mad. "It's time to go," my grandmother said. "Our work is done." She got down off her chair and picked up her handbag and slung it over her arm. She had me in her right hand and Bruno in her left. "Bruno," she said, "the time has come to restore you to the famous bosom of your family." "My mom's not very crazy about mice," Bruno said. "So I've noticed," my grandmother said. "She'll just have to get used to it, won't she?" It was not difficult to find Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. You could hear Mrs. Jenkins' shrill voice all over the room. "Herbert!" it screamed. "Herbert, get me out of here! There's mice everywhere. They're gold, they'll go up my skirts." She had her arms high up around her husband, and from where I could see, she seemed to be swinging from his neck. My grandmother advanced upon them and thrust Bruno into Mr. Jenkins' hands. "Here's your little boy," she said. "He needs to go on a diet." "Hi, Dad," Bruno said. "Hi, Mom." Miss Jenkins screamed even louder. My grandmother, with me in hand, turned and marched out of the room. She went straight across the hotel lobby and out through the front entrance into the open air. Outside, it was a lovely, warm evening, and I could hear the waves breaking on the beach just across the road from the hotel. "Is there a taxi here?" my grandmother said to the tall doorman in the green uniform. "Certainly, madame," he said, and he put two fingers in his mouth and blew a long, shrill whistle. I watched him with envy. envy. For weeks I'd been trying to whistle like that, but I hadn't succeeded once. Now I never would. The taxi came. The driver was an oldish man with a thick, black, drooping mustache. The mustache hung over his mouth like the roots of some plant. "Where to, madame?" he asked. Suddenly, he caught sight of me, a little mouse, nestled in my grandmother's head. "Blimey," he said. "What's that?" "It's my grandson," my grandmother said. "Drive us to the station, please." "I always liked mice," the old taxi driver said. "I used to keep hundreds of them when I was a boy." Mice is the fastest breeders in the world. Did you know that, ma'am? So if you're grandsons, then I reckon you'll be having a few more grandsons to go with them in a couple of weeks' time. "Drive us to the station, please," my grandmother said, looking prim. "Yes, ma'am," he said right away. My grandmother got into the back of the taxi and sat down and put me on her lap. "Are we going home?" I asked her. "Yes," she answered. "Back to Norway." "Hooray!" I cried. "Oh, hooray, hooray, hooray." "I thought you'd like that," she said. "What about your luggage?" "Who cares about luggage?" she said. The taxi was driving through the streets of Bournemouth, and this was the time of day when the pavements were crowded with holiday makers, all wandering about aimlessly with nothing to do. "How are you feeling, my darling?" my grandmother said. "Fine," I said. "Quite marvelous." She began stroking the fur on the back of my neck with one finger. "We have accomplished great feats today," she said. "It's been terrific," I said. "Absolutely terrific." The heart of a mouse. It was lovely to be back in Norway once again in my grandmother's fine old house, but now that I was so small, everything looked different, and it took me quite a while to find my way around. Mine was a world of carpets and table legs and chair legs and little crannies behind large pieces of furniture. A closed door could not be opened and nothing could be reached that was on the table. But after a few days, my grandmother began to invent gadgets for me in order to make life a bit easier. She got a carpenter to put together a number of slim, tall step ladders and placed one of these against each table of the house so that I could climb up wherever I wanted. She herself invented a wonderful door-opening device made out of wires and springs and pulleys with heavy weights dangling on cords, and soon every door in the house had a door opener on it. All I had to do was press my front paws on a tiny wooden platform, and hey, presto, a spring would stretch and a weight would drop and the door would swing open. Next, she rigged up an equally ingenious system whereby I could switch on lights whenever I entered a room at night. I cannot explain how it worked because I know nothing about electricity, but there was a little button let into the floor near the door in every room in the house, and when I pressed the button gently with one paw, the light would come on, and when I pressed it a second time, the light would go off again. My grandmother made me a tiny toothbrush using a matchstick for the handle, and into this she stuck little bits of bristle that she had snipped off one of her hairbrushes. "You must not get any holes in your teeth," she said. "I can't take a mouse to a dentist. He'd think I was crazy." "It's funny," I said, but ever since I became a mouse, I've hated the taste of sweets and chocolate, so I don't think I'll get any holes. "You are still going to brush your teeth after every meal," my grandmother said, and I did. For a bathtub, she gave me a silver sugar basin, and I bathed in it every night before going to bed. She allowed no one else into the house, not even a servant or a cook. We kept entirely to ourselves, and we were very happy in each other's company. One evening, as I lay on grandmother's lap in front of the fire, she said to me, "I wonder what happened to that little Bruno." "I wouldn't be surprised if his father gave him to the hall porter to drown in the fire bucket," I answered. "I'm afraid you might be right," my grandmother said. "Poor little thing." We were silent for a few minutes, my grandmother puffing away at her black cigar while I dozed comfortably in the warmth. "Can I ask you something, Grandmama?" I said. "Ask me anything you like, my darling." "How long does a mouse live?" "Ah," she said, "I've been waiting for you to ask that." There was a silence. She sat there smoking away and gazing at the fire. "Well," I said, "how long do we live, us mice?" "I've been reading about mice," she said. "I've been trying to find out everything I can about them." "Go on then, Grandmama. Why don't you tell me?" "If you really want to know," she said, "I'm afraid a mouse doesn't live for very long." "How long?" I asked. "Well, an ordinary mouse only lives for about 3 years," she said. "But you are not an ordinary mouse. You are a mouse person. And that's a very different matter." "How different?" I asked. How long does a mouse person live? Longer, she said. Much longer. How much longer? I asked. A mouse person will almost certainly live for 3 times as long as an ordinary mouse, my grandmother said. About 9 years. Good, I cried. That's great. It's the best news I've ever had. Why do you say that? She asked, surprised. Because I would never want to live longer than you, I said. I couldn't stand being looked after by anybody else. There was a short silence. She had a way of fondling me behind the ears with the tip of one finger. It felt lovely. How old are you, Grandmama? I asked. I'm 86, she said. Will you live another 8 or 9 years? I might, she said, with a bit of luck. You've got to, I said, because then I'll be a very old mouse and you'll be a very old grandmother. And soon after that, we'll both die together. That would be perfect, she said. I had a little doze after that, and I shut my eyes and thought of nothing and felt at peace with the world. Would you like me to tell you something about yourself that's very interesting, my grandmother said. Yes, please, Grandmama, I said, without opening my eyes. I couldn't believe it at first, but apparently it's quite true, she said. What is it? I asked. The heart of a mouse, she said, and that means your heart is beating at a rate of 500 times a minute. Isn't that amazing? It's not possible, I said, opening my eyes wide. It's as true as I'm sitting here, she said. It's a sort of miracle. That's nearly 9 beats every second, I cried, working it out in my head. Correct, she said. Your heart is going so fast it's impossible to hear the separate beats. All it hears is a soft humming sound. She was wearing a lace dress, and the lace kept tickling my nose, so I had to rest my head on my front paws. Have you ever heard my heart humming away, Grandmama? I asked. Often, she said. I hear it when you're lying very close to me on the pillow at night. The two of us remained silent in front of the fire for a long time after that, thinking about these wonderful things. My darling, she said at last, are you sure you don't mind being a mouse for the rest of your life? I don't mind at all, I said. It doesn't matter who you are or what you look like, so long as somebody loves you. It's off to work we go. For supper that evening, my grandmother had a plain omelet and 1 slice of bread. I had a piece of brown Norwegian goat's milk cheese known as just, which I loved even when I was a boy. We ate in front of the fire, my grandmother in her armchair and me on the table, with my cheese on a small plate. Grandmama, I said, now that we have done away with the Grand High Witch, will all the other witches in the world gradually disappear? I'm quite sure they won't, she answered. I stopped chewing and stared at her. But they must, I cried. Surely they must. I'm afraid not, she said. But if she's not there any longer, how are they going to get all the money they need? And who's going to give them orders and jazz them up at the annual meetings and invent all their magic formulas for them? When a queen bee dies, there is always another queen in the hive ready to take her place, my grandmother said. It's the same with witches. In the great headquarters where the Grand High Witch lives, there's always another Grand High Witch waiting in the wings to take over, should anything happen. Ooh, we almost made it, guys. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, we'll finish it tomorrow, and then we'll have to choose a new book. All right.